All right. Good afternoon, boys and girls and other non-conforming gender people. Um, we are picking up the second half of a lecture uh, on immigration and xenophobia in California, largely in the 19 teens and 20s. You guys already had this whole part from part one in the other video. So we're going to part two here. We're going to center on eugenics, which you've probably heard of, but maybe you don't know much about what it is. And you probably certainly didn't know that California was a eugenics leader for the world and had some pretty horrible influences. So before I get into explaining about what eugenics was, I want to get into more about California in this time. This is going to be kind of running parallel to the other lecture. The first half of this lecture was centering on immigration and then immigration restrictions and things like that. This is the same, it happened at the same time, but just a bit focusing on something a little different. And I want to begin with the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco. And this is a big deal. This was a big sort of World's Fair type thing. We don't have World's Fairs anymore, but they used to have these fairs where, people come from around the world, or at least around the country or in the region, to see all kinds of different exhibits and ride on rides and all that stuff like that. This one wasn't too heavy on rides, but it was a thing celebrating two things. It was the opening of the Panama Canal, which was a big deal for that opened in 1911. And that made it a lot easier for ships to be able to get to California from the Atlantic. It really links the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans a much easier way. So for California shipping and connection to the world, that's a big thing that people in California were celebrating. The other thing was sort of celebrating the return of San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake. There had been, so much of the city had been devastated. This was a way of telling the world, we are open for business again. We are a world-class city. We still have all of this power, whatnot. And to do this, they built basically a city within the city, which is seen here in the lower picture. It's an artist rendering of it. I don't have any good pictures of it, at least that show the whole thing like that. But this was in the Marina District. Those of you that don't know San Francisco, although I'm sure all of you have been there, but this is on the front northern part of the city. If you're in the city and you go up Van Ness and then you're going towards the Golden Gate Bridge, that's the Marina District you're driving through, down Lombard Street there. Or if you're driving, from the north over the Golden Gate Bridge, the first sort of neighborhood you come into San Francisco, the first thing you hit is the Presidio. That's the old military base, which dates back to the Spanish. Then it was an American military base. Now it's a national park. Then the first actual neighborhood you hit is the Marina District, and now it's very posh, fashionable, for young techies, super high rent, all that kind of stuff. Pretty nice restaurants, but not my kind of people in the neighborhood I want to hang out with typically. But anyhow, long tangent that didn't need to be there. In the Marina District, they basically leveled the part that's along the coast and built this temporary city. It was only there for a year in this sort of Turkish style. And they invite people for these all kinds of, symposiums. Smart people from around the world are going to come to these big sort of conferences and stuff. I should say the only part of it that's still standing, when this thing's over, they level it again and rebuild, and there's much houses there now. And there's some houses that have pieces of this old exhibit, but the only thing there now in full is the dome you're seeing right here, which is known as the Palace of Fine Arts. And if you've ever been there, you know, there's this beautiful dome along the lake there, and this, you know, awesome classical style. It's huge, you know, it's really tall. So that gives you a sense of scale for how big this entire project was along here. So anyway, yeah, I mean, they did have rides, you know, not much in the way of that, but it was really more a thing for celebrating sort of intellectual thought, is looking towards the future. This time in history is everybody like had this idea of like science. Like, we understand so much about science now, we can do anything with it. You know, there were all these modern marvels. You know, like I said, they've been building bridges like farther than they were able to do. They're able to make skyscrapers now. Flight had recently been a thing that was a big deal. Like, you know, man had conquered the air, you know, kind of thing. And everybody, you know, had these high hopes that basically like science could fix all the problems of the world. Is all we needed. You know, just to put some thought into it, get the right engineers, even, you know, in governance and you know, and how society is run. You know, this is out of the era of the Gilded Age. Like, a lot of corruption had been done away with, and you know, good government types are, you know, putting in progressive policies that, you know, are, you know, better for the people. People are being better educated. You know, things like that. So everybody has this very hopeful idea for the future, and just anything is possible, and that is pervasive, you know, really throughout most of the Western world at this time, especially in the United States, and more than anywhere else here in California. California was a leader of that. Like I've said, you know, a couple of times about, you know, we were you know, at the forefront of this progressive era in offering women's voting rights and property rights. You know, there's still parts of the country where, like, you know, women couldn't hold property or inherit property and stuff like that. And, you know, California offered that kind of stuff. And they had recently given the women the right to vote in California here. They're expanding the public school system. So every person can go, you know, K through 12 school for free. You know, and it's not a mandatory thing yet, but it's just being offered to people. California is leading the way in environmental protection. This is sort of a new kind of concept. Is, you know, they call it environmental conservation at this time. The idea of, like, maybe we don't have to like pave over everything. You know, for a long time, Americans really have this kind of attitude of like, we have to conquer wilderness. Wilderness is a thing. And really, humanity in general kind of thought like civilization moving forward is, you know, is, you have to get away the savage wilderness, you know, kind of thing. But Californians were, you know, leading the way of being like, hey, maybe we want to save beautiful places, and we start having national and state parks, Yosemite and Muir Woods, you know, places like that that we need to preserve for future generations. That was the sort of big thought. They didn't think that much about necessarily keeping things clean in a way that we might think of, like, oh, well, you don't want your water to get polluted upstream because that, you know, that goes downstream and ruins different ecosystems and, you know, goes into drinking water. They're really sort of just figuring out that sort of interconnection, and, you know, they're not, environmental protection in that sense is going to be a long way off, but they are in the sense of just conservation. You know, we don't have to chop down every single tree and put up a parking lot kind of thing. So like I said, California is very much leading the way, and they're very proud. You know, anything's possible. It's no accident that science fiction appears at this time. You know, science fiction really begins with H.G. Wells in the 1890s and becomes really popular in this era in a very positive way. Nowadays, science fiction is, we think of as dystopian, of like, you know, how humanity ruined the world, you know, kind of thing, and survivors have to make it in whatever apocalypse happened. That very utopian view of science fiction, of like anything can be achieved through science, And like I said, Californians were very much leading the way on that entire uh, line of thought. And one of the, so you'd be walking around this Panama Pacific conference, and the fair, and you go into these different sort of symposiums where they have like scientists and doctors and writers and all these smart people, and you would be popping into them, and people would be talking about, oh, this is the importance of public education, this is the importance of rooting out corruption in government and city management and all that kind of stuff. And you'd be walking to these different ones, and you would walk in and find a number of these different symposiums all around about the protecting the white race. We think of today, we associate progressivism with being anti-racist, but at this time that wasn't necessarily the case. And there were a lot of these sort of progressive people that saw the future of California could only be made brighter by keeping people of color out of California. They would be talking about this stuff in a very scientific sort of way. In the South, they'd be the type of, the southern states, this is Jim Crow era segregation, and there's this very conservative idea of having like, oh, we got to keep the races separated, because black and white people can't live together for all these sort of old thought reasons. Well, Californians in a lot of ways had come to similar conclusions, kind of in just different ways. And that you would hear scientists talking about how, it's a well-known fact that, people of color carry diseases and that they're unclean. And, if they're allowed to stay in California, that will cause a pandemic kind of thing. And saying, oh, it's not their fault. It's their genes, it's not, there's a sense of like, no sense of anger towards these people. They're just genetically predisposed to be unclean and carry diseases, which of course is not true, but they were very much thinking that it's scientific fact at the time. And that those people living amongst us that are basically genetic time bombs. And, it's not just that they would be in their genes, that would make them more predisposed to be criminals. And that's there's a criminal gene within you, and you might see like teenagers walking around on the street that seem innocent, and they're going to schools with our kids, and they might seem okay, but essentially, at some point, their genes are going to take over, and they're going to mug you, or rape you, or kill you, or kidnap your daughter, things like that. That's just science. It's more likely that they're going to do that, and the more people of color you have, the more likely that stuff is going to happen. And also the stuff of like, these people are lazy, or they'll be a drag on the economy. It's genetically predisposed that they don't want to work, that kind of stuff. And something's got to be done about it right now. And again, you remember, racism is a new word. Racism, the term was first in print in 1903. Nobody is really associating racism as being necessarily a bad thing, or would not think of themselves as being racist. They think of themselves in this very, oh, we have scientific evidence to back up our, everything we have here. Like we've done science so well. And you would walk in to, somewhere, if you're at this fair, there's a place called the Race Betterment booth that was teaching, the importance of preserving the white race. Again, like I said, once all of these bad traits are associated with foreigners, they said like if we delude our blood, if there's too much interbreeding with with people of color, that will ruin whiteness. And whiteness is basically everything that is good with civilization, and this great better future that we are hoping to build will not be able to be achieved because we will have dumbed ourselves down in this way. And it literally, they dumb like the intelligence is another trait that they're associating with this. And they would talk about openly, scientists would be using terms like morons, dullards, cripples. Those were the terms that they would use, consider within polite society, about these people. And I think also, at this time, the most famous writer in America is Bay Area native Jack London, very famous writer from Oakland, and later on moves up into Sonoma and writes tons of books about the Bay Area and everything. And he's a celebrated writer. We have Jack London Square, all that kind of stuff. And Jack London was a great writer. He's also he was a socialist, and he believed in progressive policies that would help the working people out. He was a great friend to the working class, but he's also a committed racist. It's not hard to see in his books. He does not have a lot of people of color in his books, but when they do show up, they're not very well thought of. And he always talks about, if you ever read, there's a book, Valley of the Moon, which is a great book in a lot of ways, but it's essentially a book that's about this working class guy in Oakland who's sick of the dirty city and wants to get out, and him and his wife, who's literally named Saxon, her name is Saxon, like Anglo-Saxon, and they travel around California looking for the perfect spot to settle down, and they're encountering all of these different people along the way that are Portuguese, Italians, Japanese, Chinese people, and in a lot of ways, like, he's saying like, oh, these people like work really hard, but this is not where they're supposed to be. They're not supposed to be here with us. And yes, they run farms and they're very effective, but they talk about California being, he talks about the pioneer stock, the hardy pioneer stock. And what he means by that is white people, and he celebrates the people who came in caravans over the mountains, like the Donner Party, and settled in California, and saying, California is really for them, not for all of these new immigrants that are coming in. And that's the type of stuff people are reading, and again, thinking of this, they're thinking of it in this progressive sort of way. What else I have here? So you would come to this booth, you get a history of the white race, all the great things white people have done. I'm gonna come back to this slide, and the other slide. My things are a little out of order here. Recently, a book had been written called "The Passing of the Great White Race" by a New York scientist or an historian. He's really a lawyer. There's a lot of sort of intellectuals at this time that considered themselves to be experts in everything. And this guy, Madison Grant, wrote this book, The Passing of the Great White Race, and in which he argues that basically all good things humanity has done were done by white people. And the all great inventions, that have pushed humanity forward were really done by white people. Never mind gunpowder coming from China, or math coming from, the Middle East, or I don't know what he has to say about Jesus, but I'm sure he believed he was white. And he even breaks up white people into different categories. There's many subcategories, but there's essentially 3 different categories that he has, and there's a bunch of subcategories within that, and they're ranked for sure. And the people that are at the top, he sees as people that are from Northern Europe, people originally coming from Scandinavia, and then had settled into Britain, France, parts of Germany, the Netherlands, but not. These are the Nordic people, being like they are the best of the best. Then the next below that is what he calls the Alpine race, which are people from Central Europe and Northern Asia. This Germans, Russians, Celtic people, which would be Irish and things like that. So they're the next step down. Then the bottom of whiteness are Mediterranean people, he calls them, which are people from Southern Europe, North Africa, the Middle East. And like I said, there's a bunch of subcategories in there, but he basically, puts all white people, into this. And he even says that truly everything that great has been done comes from the Nordic people. Basically, they invented everything and everybody else had just copied them. And he sort of rewrites history to adjust for this. For instance, like the Roman Empire was, because I've talked about before, this great empire that lasted, over centuries, that basically, had conquered almost all of Europe. It's an Italian empire. Rome is in Italy. Mediterranean people, which he sees, at the bottom of the barrel here. And he said, no, what actually happened, they were, like, Italians were originally Nordic people, but then they were too permissive towards immigrants, letting immigrants into the country and or into their empire, and basically they interbred with the Italians, and blonde hair and blue eyes became dark hair and olive complexion, and that is why the Roman Empire fell, because they didn't hold on to their Nordic race, and if they, that's as an example, if the United States doesn't do the same type of thing, then they will, that's the end of it. This book was very, very influential in the United States. When I talked about the Immigration Act in 1924, that's one of the reasons they passed it. The authors were like talking about this book when they did it. It's very influential for Hitler and Germany, and it's very influential to people in California who are going to be making public policy. And there's another person outside of California that's going to be influential, and again, he's going to get in the mix of this idea of eugenics and preserving whiteness. The sponsor of this race betterment booth is by a guy named John Harvey Kellogg, which is, yes, that Kellogg, as in Kellogg cereal. Kellogg was originally a doctor, and he is the guy that invented cornflakes. He was a doctor in Michigan who ran a sanitarium. Sanitariums at this time were not necessarily like mental illness. There would be people with mental illness there, but they sort of any sort of disorder that you needed sort of long-term care, you could be at these sort of sanitariums. And you had a lot of people with stomach disorders, any gastrointestinal problem, and he invented cornflakes as a thing that it's easier to digest and eat if you have stomach problems. Which, like, breakfast, in the 19th century is basically just, it's gonna be giant hunks of lard and meat and things like that. And people would realize it's a sort of healthier, easier option. I very much prefer to start my day with something lighter like cereal. His brother got the idea of like, hey, we can market this and sell this to everybody. And Kellogg says, okay, great. And let his brother start the Kellogg company, who, goes on, is still selling cereals today. And this will give Kellogg a lot of money to put his ideas further out and help fund all kinds of scientific research that might not have otherwise have been funded. And the things that Kellogg believed were a little out there, for sure. And for one thing, he's obsessed with cleanliness. He was super anal retentive. He'd wear white suits when he was on his rounds throughout the sanitarium, because so he could see if just a little bit of dirt got onto it. If it got even slightly dirty, he would go change his clothes immediately. So he wanted to be able to know if dirt is on him, because he hated the idea of knowing that it's on him and not knowing that it's there. So that's, tells you a little bit something. He's also super anti-sex. He thinks sex is the root of all problems that humans have. He had seen a lot of people that had venereal diseases, like syphilis and stuff, that he was treating at his clinic, and and that made said, well, if they weren't messing around with people they weren't supposed to mess around with, they wouldn't have caught this disease. So, but he also thinks that sex in general is bad for your mental health, even within a marriage. He said the only reason people should ever have sex, even husband and wife, is to procreate. You should only have sex a couple times in your life to procreate, and that's it. Harvey himself had 8 kids, all of whom were adopted. So I think it's possible that he never had sex his entire life, because he had such crazy hangups about it. He even invented a procedure to make masturbation super painful. He did it for both men and women. That'd be separate procedures, but a thing that you can't stop them from doing it, but if they did, it would hurt. And I don't know what that entails, but he thought that basically masturbation just drives people insane. So that tells you quite a bit about where Kellogg's coming from with this stuff. And he also, that's really sort of tied up to all of this. Go on, get. What's tied up in all of this is the idea of racial preservation. He very much believes in clean living, and so you don't let negative traits in, and the people that have the most negative traits are people that are not white. And he helps fund the American Eugenics movement, which would be more on the fringe of science for the most part, up until Kellogg starts putting a bunch of money into it. And it becomes more and more mainstream. So what is eugenics? It's the idea of artificial selection over natural selection. So this is not long. This is in the decades after Darwin's theory of evolution had become widespread, and they understand that basically any organism evolves through the natural selection, the sense of it's random mutations that makes an organism better suited for its environment, and then it's more likely to procreate, so it passes that mutation on to its offspring. And so in that way, through these random mutations, any organism becomes that much more stronger and evolves. Eugenicists believe that humanity had come to a point that had understood science and biology and genes so well that they could start manipulating human evolution. And if through different sorts of practices, that they could regulate through certain laws and scientific practices and medical procedures and things like that we're going to get into, and you control who's breeding with who, we can basically make humanity into a super race, breed out all of the bad traits that are in people, and keep all of the good traits, and make those stronger. And obviously this is not good science. It assumes everything is according to genes. It's very much favoring nature over nurture. Saying almost nurture does not matter. It's all about nature. It's this idea. If two criminals, say Bonnie and Clyde bank robbing couple, say if they had a kid that was adopted by somebody after Bonnie and Clyde die, and were raised in a perfectly good family, law-abiding, good Christian family, all that kind of stuff with good values, the genes in that kid would inevitably grow up to be a criminal also, because of who his parents were. So we know that's not true. But everything about eugenics assumes that type of stuff to be true. And of course, the traits that they see, the people who are coming up with this, white, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon Americans who are doing this, see the traits that they have as being the best, and traits other people have as being bad, which is just different cultures have different ways of doing things. In Latin America, the idea of the siesta. Americans would look at that and say like, oh, they're just being lazy. With that type of stuff. There's something genetically in them that makes them take siestas because they're lazy. It's that sort of assumptions. So eugenics is going to try and preserve the traits that they like and get rid of all of the other ones. And there's stuff that they positive eugenics in the sense of like they think of being, oh, if we educate people, that'll help nature conservation, making for a better environment. All of that stuff is good for the future of humanity, and it'll improve us as a race. But mostly they centered on, and we're going to center on, the sense of negative eugenics, which would be deporting immigrant people, or people of color from the United States, or segregating them. Like we saw, in California, segregation of Chinese people in the north, and the south, segregating of Mexican Americans. And this is where they really line up with, conservatives of the South. These progressive liberals are, agreeing with people in the South, conservative segregationists saying black and white have to live separately, so to prevent race mixing and all that kind of stuff. They're very much agreeing with that. And of course, there's also sterilization, which we're going to mostly center on here, which is the sense of preventing people from ever having children. The best way to, they see to make sure bad genes are not passed on to future generations is to keep the people they don't like from procreating. And there's a number of other things that they're going to do. They have selective breeding programs, which never really takes off. This is the idea of putting, say a woman who's like an Olympic level gymnast. She's a gold medal gymnast, and have her have a kid with some like Nobel winning chemist, and his brains and her athletic finesse put together is going to make a super baby kind of thing. And this is pretty hard to do because people tend not to procreate with people because the betterment of humanity kind of thing. They do it because they love somebody, or at the very least they just want to have sex with that person. Probably in that scenario, the chemist would be much more excited about this idea than the gymnast was. And so that never really takes off. There's also these eugenic certificates, which were very popular in California to have. You go to, when you're going to get married, before you get married, before you make this, official, you both go to the doctor and get, they do a checkup and ask you questions about family history and things like that, and they give you this eugenic certificate, saying that your genes are good, you have perfect physical and mental balance, and you are fit to breed with, essentially. And there were things that, like, if you didn't do well on this, I'm sorry, honey, we can't get married. So that's kind of crazy. But we're going to center on the kind of most extreme of these, and that's, like I said, compulsory sterilization, because this is, all of the other things are voluntary, though of course deportation and segregation are not. But what they're going to be manipulate people's bodies without their consent is a crazy thing that happens a lot in California. It's going to be legally done, and it's largely going to be sponsored by a guy named Charles M. Goad. And like Kellogg, funded a lot of the sort of eugenics programs in America overall and scientific research on it. Goad was centered in California. He was a Sacramento businessman, very rich, very racist. He prided himself on not ever having deals with Latin American or Chinese people, and like to brag about they have become rich and successful without ever having done that. He's going to put in the funding for these organizations like the Human Betterment Foundation and the Eugenics Society in Northern California, which is going to work with local governments to pass laws to make all this legal, for one, and also to actually do put doctors in the right places, and you have doctors that are like hired, that are part of the Human Veteran Foundations, that be put in sanitariums, or maybe working with local law enforcement and things like that. And I mean, come on, like, just look at this guy. This, he's evil in this picture here. He, like, it looks like a cross between Eric Trump and Billy Zane's character in Titanic. There's no way that dude in that chair, in that suit, is not an evil guy. And he's, yeah, I mean, just openly white supremacist. Even after a lot of this stuff goes out of style because of the Holocaust in Germany, really what eugenics leads up to is the extermination of 6 million people by the Nazis. He's still gonna, like, support eugenics programs and saying that, like, everything the Nazis did up until extermination was fine. And even as they're, like, in the 1960s, when they're like, those people, former Nazis, are on trial and going to prison and being executed and stuff like that, he's still saying, yeah, that was great what they were doing. So that tells you about him, and he is going to be the major push behind the eugenics program in California, which is going to be, there's going to be eugenics programs in, I think, like 30 of the 50 states. But California is the leader in this because we're progressive. We lead the way. We love science. We're pushing humanity forward. And that's how they thought about it. So they're going to help. They're going to get these laws passed, where the first law gets passed in 1909 that says it targets patients at state hospitals and institutions. People that are deemed, the word they use, I'm just going to say it, they say people that are deemed mentally retarded, or prison inmates that have been labeled, or that are sex offenders. So those people can be sterilized. We want to make sure that they're not able to breed, and they have to be at a certain institution. A few years later, in 1913, a more expansive law gets passed, saying that anyone who is under state care, who is quote, afflicted with hereditary insanity or incurable chronic mania or dementia, could be sterilized. It's a broad term, I think. Hereditary insanity or incurable chronic mania or dementia. Like, I don't know. That's seems a number of things could sort of fit into that category. But it basically says, if 3 doctors, if a panel of 3 doctors, if 2 out of the 3 agree to sterilize somebody, they're getting sterilized. And finally, there'll be another law passed later that year to basically cover their ass in all of this. That says that there's no legal mechanism for patients to challenge sterilization. Like, once the order comes down, they can't challenge it, and after it happens to them, they can't sue. They have no repercussions for what was done to them. And again, yeah, this is these laws. California will lead the way in this, and later on in the 1920s, the Supreme Court will upheld and say that this is legal, and this is like the Nazis, like Adolf Hitler, will be writing. He writes in his book Mein Kampf that, like, I like what California is doing with their eugenics programs and their immigration programs. I'm going to copy that here in Germany. Like, he explicitly says that. So we'll get more into that a little bit later. This is a form approving the sterilization of a young woman in the 1940s. Well, most people were sterilized when they're under state care at certain sort of sanitariums and clinics and things like that. One of the biggest places to sterilize people was up in Sonoma County, the Sonoma State Home. This building's still there today, but now it's like a research center. And this was an intake form approving of it at this time not intake, but she's already a patient in the hospital, and it's approving for her sterilization. And it tells quite a bit about how they decide these things. So personal history, her name is blocked out there. Personal history, she's 15 years and 2 months. Nativity, which mean where's she from? California. So she's born here. Religion, Catholic. First, the fact that right here, like that is relevant. Her religion is a somehow this is a medical thing, or if she has some sort of, if there's some sort of hereditary disorder or something like that, why would her religion play a role in that? It shows you that, like, how they viewed things at this time. And I think we have, we could assume Catholic, in a lot of ways probably meant she was Latina. I'll talk more about it soon, but majority of the people sterilized were Latin American. So she's single, says she's female, she has no children. She has the date, this is April 23rd, 1943. The present diagnosis is a history of emotional instability. That's vague as hell. Like, I don't know anybody who doesn't have some history of emotional instability. Most stable people I know still have emotional instability to some extent. Like, what did she do to get that diagnosis? We don't know. But there is, like, further down, patient is afflicted with, the one that's marked here is feeble-mindedness. It has the check there. It says her IQ is 71, and then it's borderline. I should point out here that the IQ tests were incredibly racially biased at this time. I had read somewhere once about an IQ test that was used in the 1920s throughout the entire country that asked who the shortstop was for the Brooklyn Dodgers. What? like how is that somehow testing an IQ? There's like this piece of trivia which is centered men in the Northeast, white men, in the Northeast are most likely to know that. How the hell is a Latina woman in Northern California going to know or care who the hell the shortstop is of the Brooklyn Dodgers? So that gives you an idea of why she probably didn't do that well on this test. It also tells us here that her parents are dead and she has no legal guardian. And it gives the approval for her to be sterilized. She will have a surgical procedure that was done to her, so she is never able to have children. Again, she's 15 years old. And there's a number of different ways that this procedure would be done. There could be, tube cutting or tube tying. Full hysterectomies were sometimes the case. The full removal of the uterus which is an incredibly invasive procedure. It's still very painful, and today that has a long recovery time, but it's really, really back then could take you out for a long time, and you have long-term damage. There's also chemical hysterectomies where they could inject you with something that makes it so. It sounds gross, but essentially the uterus is eaten up in the inside by some sort of chemical. I don't know exactly how that works, but I know it was a thing that was done. So there's a number of ways that they did this. They didn't care that much as long as they're sterilized. And not everybody who got it knew that it was done. It could be done in a way like, if it wasn't a full hysterectomy, it could be done so you didn't even know it was done. The Human Betterment Foundation worked with the Los Angeles Police Department, and God, my cat is driving me nuts. Get in. The Human Betterment Foundation worked with the LAPD to sterilize women who were arrested, and would be given sort of like they get an examination as part of their intake. As they're arrested, they do a quick we want to make sure you're healthy before we put you into the jail population or whatever. And essentially what they would do is any Mexican American woman who was who'd be brought in, and there are some forms that the reason for sterilization says they had a Mexican mentality. That was enough to say that meaning they're Mexican, so that was enough justification to sterilize them. And essentially, like at this, they would pick up any young Latina who was on the street without male supervision, who's not being accompanied by a man, who's not there with a father or brother or husband, or something like that. So, young women who are just going to the movies or something like that, if there's not a man with them, they could be picked up, because the idea was they must be prostitutes. There's no reason for a young woman to be on the street by herself unless she's a prostitute. So they would get picked up and booked on prostitution charges. A lot of times they would drop the charges. They'd say, oh, we're going to let you go. But they take them to the police station. They're given a medical, what they're told is in a medical examination. In that medical examination, they're sterilized. And they leave without knowing what happened, and then find themselves not being able to have kids. I read a story about a young woman named Mary Franco, who was in a state institution at 14 years old. She was sterilized without her knowledge. When she got out, she went on lead a normal life, what she thought. She had gotten married, and that she kept trying to have kids, and wasn't able to with her husband. So she went to the doctor to see what was okay, and the doctor inspected her. The word he used is she was butchered on the inside. I don't have any more specifics than that, but that's what he described looking like on the inside. Her husband, class act, a guy, of course, divorced her, because if she doesn't, she can't have children. What good is she? 1940s, and she led the rest of her life being incredibly depressed. She never married again, and was incredibly depressed. So this was, like I said, this was horrifying. We don't have good numbers of how many people this happened to. After the 1940s, after the Holocaust, a lot of the records mysteriously disappeared for some reason. Once people realized we had a similar program to Nazi Germany, they, like all of a sudden they didn't have good records. Records we do have, though, we had lists of names. Not everything had gotten destroyed, and about 80% of the names of people that we know were sterilized have Spanish last names, or Hispanic last names. I would say Latino men were 23% more likely to be sterilized than white women, or white men. Latino women are 59% more likely to be sterilized than non-Latina. Like I said, this is just, it's incredibly disturbing. This is like science fiction type stuff. What I think of it as being, picking people up and manipulating their bodies, and sending them back out. Like I said, this will become less popular. So anyway, the Nazis, when the Nazis come to power in Germany in the early 1930s, they send they copy the 1924 Immigration Act is one thing that they do, and they look to California for other immigration laws. But they also send Nazi scientists to California. They send California scientists go to Nazi Germany and advise them on how to better have this program. And the first people that start getting put into German concentration camps are first communists. They're basically political. They're like, oh, these people are terrorists, and they want to overthrow the government, so we have to lock them up. Then they start locking up people with any sort of what they see is mental or physical disabilities, and they're going to go a step further than we ever went in California to euthanize the person. And get the worst ever that got done in the United States was make sure this person can't ever have kids. The Nazis went the next step further and, you know, euthanizing them. The sign here, I don't have the translation with me here, says something effectively as like, you know, this man right here, and it's like, this man costs, you know, $6,000 a month to, you know, of your money to keep alive. Like, is that worth it? You know, and they, you know, this is advocating, you know, like, isn't it better for society to put this man down? And once they start doing this in California, there were many California scientists like, we need to get to that. We need to pass laws here so we can start doing that. We could make everything so much better right now to just cut these people off completely. Of course, then, you know, those concentration camps in Germany are going to start expand the, you know, the undesirable people that, you know, that need to be, you know, euthanized will get, you know, will be specific ethnicities. You know, will be Jewish people, Romani, which are, it's the correct term for you think of gypsies and things like that. Also, homosexual people, you know, are going to seem to have some sort of be defective in some sort of way. So, you know, they're like, better off to kill all these people now. Then once in the United States, we find out the extent of how bad all of this was, and we start calling it the Holocaust, it falls out of style. The eugenics programs go underground, but they don't stop at that point. They keep going in California, and they keep going throughout the United States. I had read a story of a Native American woman or girl, I should say, in the 1950s, who lived in the eastern part of California in the Mojave Desert area. Who at age 11 was given an injection. She came in for a vaccine, and they also gave in her an injection that gave her a chemical hysterectomy at 11 years old. And this was done, yeah, in the 1950s. You know, she didn't do anything or anything like that. It was because she was Native American. There's also programs that, you know, the Human Betterment Foundation was still around. It kind of merged into more mainstream groups. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, they would have programs that, you know, worked with the, you know, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which was a same sort of thing as saying, we're going to give vaccines, and they would vaccinate people and then also give injections around Latin America that would also sterilize women, you know, outside of the United States, you know, throughout Latin America. Yeah, I mean, and these type of things happened in, you know, in the American South, and you know, like Mississippi, Alabama, it was happening to African American women. Even in the 1960s. In the South, there was stuff where they were giving contraception to women, and it would be something that would permanently sterilize them. And like the excuse was sort of given by the people who did it, be like, oh, hey, women's liberation, you know, they say they want birth control. How are we to know if they want it permanent or not? You know, like they don't want to get pregnant this month, or they just never want it again. Well, what's the difference? You know, that kind of thing. Here in California, one of the last sort of famous cases was in the 1970s, in 1975. The UC Medical Center in Los Angeles were sterilizing Mexican American women who would come in. They had kids. They're pregnant. They had come in, have a baby at the hospital. And then during their recovery, the doctor would sterilize them. Only Mexican Americans they would do this to. They said, one baby is enough for you. And they didn't tell the women that they had, they had no idea this was happening. until one of the doctors had smuggled out the documents, proving that this was happening, to a civil rights lawyer. The civil rights lawyer brought a suit against the UC Medical Center, and the judge eventually ruled in favor of the hospital, saying, because the hospital argued that we told these women, they just didn't speak English. That was the problem. So he ruled in favor of them and saying, well, you have to have translators present at the hospital from now on. It's strange that they never said they never said they were doing this to white women. Why is it only like these Mexican American women that have been told, and they don't speak English, that they can't have babies? And there's a documentary about this, which I haven't been able to get a hold of yet, called No Mas Babies. And even in more recently, it was happening in California prisons in the early part of the 2000s, where a doctor was sterilizing incarcerated women without proper consent. When asked why he was doing it, and finally called on it, he said he was saving the state money in future welfare costs for unwanted children. So he took it upon himself to decide that they can't ever have kids. They committed a crime, so we need to make sure that obviously they will be bad parents forever, and they'll cost the state money. And they can't decide to have kids. Out of it, they would, any children they have will of course be unwanted, and of course there'll be a drain on the state. That's what he assumed. All of that stuff on his patients, and took upon himself to sterilize them. And I mean, it's not. It was mostly Latino women that this was being done to in the prisons, and it's not totally surprising, the way, Latino women are used, as are portrayed in politics and media in lots of cases, and the sense of anchor babies and stuff like that, where, their uterus is seen as some sort of a threat to the United States of America or something like that. So when it got out, Jerry Brown, who was governor at the time, banned forced sterilizations in prison, make sure, because the doctor who was doing this, it was not actually illegal for him to be doing that. The laws were still on the books that allowed him to be able to do this. So he didn't actually break the law. As far as I know, he got fired, but he couldn't be prosecuted. But now, if caught, that can be prosecuted. But there is, this is still happening somewhere. We don't know where, we don't know how, but we know these type of things still happen. And I would guess in the last 4 years, it's probably happening more than ever. Or at least more than it was 4 years before that. Anyway, find this stuff, yeah, highly disturbing. It's California, progressive, liberal California. All right, I'll talk to you guys later.